Hello everyone, so in this video I'm going to show you how to update your ESC firmware for your Digital 2 or your Super LCG speed controller and your program box. Now let's get to it. You want to go to R1Works' website, click on the ESC tab, which will give you the option of clicking on the Digital 2 or the Super LCG. Scroll to the very bottom and you will click on this download link here. That will allow you to download a file which will look like something like this. It'll say ESC box tools and manuals. You'll click on that and it will open up to this window here. Now you have two files here. You have your ESC box firmware and your manuals and setup sheet. This is just a digital form of the manual and whatever setup sheets. You can print it off if you need to. Now let's go to the ESC firmware section, which the video is all about. Now you have box firmware file, ESC firmware, and you have your R1 update tool version 1.2. You want to download the update tool first and install it, and it will look like this. All right. So once you got that, you're ready to go to start installing firmware on your program box or your ESC. Now, I think the standard firmware that's downloaded onto your program box and your ESC is the 205 firmware and the 107 firmware. I'll explain that in a second here. Just very, very quickly, you need to have the correct box firmware downloaded in order to interact with the ESC. All right, let me just move this here. So for example, I have the 205 box firmware on here right now. If I was to install a firmware, for example, such as a 114 ESC firmware, the connection would not happen because the 114 firmware, it requires a different box firmware, and I'll show you that in a couple seconds. Anyway, so let's go quickly here to the computer. You have click on box firmware. This is the ED410205. I usually just reference it by saying 205 just to make things easier. So that is your box firmware. And then you have your ESC firmware. You have your LCG, modified, ROR, BRCA, EFRA, so obviously this will be for Blinky. And the Blinky version is 107. Modified, you have 109, 110, 113, 114. LCG, it's just simply LCG. Now one thing to keep in mind is the 107 will use the 205 box firmware. In the modified category, the 109, 110, and 113 uses the 205 box firmware, and the LCG will use the 205 box firmware. So the only firmware that is not used, the only box firmware that is different is the 114, and you'll see here the ED410207. So in order for the box to communicate with the ESC when it comes to downloading the firmware onto the ESC, you must use the 207. Okay, I hope that makes sense. So let's get to it here. Let's go to the updater tool. Now, the connection to the box here, I'm not too sure what the connection is, but you need one of these guys. I think most electronic devices use them. So connect to your program box. And let's take a look here. It says here the US adapter is communicating, so we got the good connection status. Let's connect on to program box. Let's see what the program box pulls up. All right, so we got the 207, which is kind of the firmware for the 114. So I currently have the 207 on my program box. Now let's take a look at what firmware version I have on my ESC. Now, in order to connect to the ESC, you just connect it accordingly, like so. If you somehow connect it the wrong way, you won't get the fan to turn at all. All right, so if I plug it in backwards, nothing happens. Okay, so connecting it the right way, you'll hear the connection status sound, which it chimes on my computer, may not for yours, but everything's functioning now. So click on the ESC, and what does it say? It points out I'm running a 114. All right, now I want to change my firmware. So first step is you want to take a look at changing the box firmware first. So I'm going to click on the 205, and you are going to click Run Update. Now, while this is updating, what I like to do is pull out the files individually onto my desktop so I can see them right away. And that makes things a lot easier, because if they're still within this file, it's very difficult to find them. All right. So I've updated to a 205 now. So I've changed the box firmware to a 205. Now what I need to do is update my ESC firmware to a 107. And let's update to a 107. And shouldn't take too long. So I'm changing my firmware from a 114 to a 107. And we should be good now. Yep, everything's good. So the firmware version on my ESC is now 107, and the program box is a 205, and we're all done. That's all you need to do. You can just simply unplug everything and you're good to go. Now, just keep in mind that when you are updating your ESC or your firmware box, make sure, the box firmware, make sure you're using the correct firmware on your program box in order to communicate with your ESC. If not, you'll have some issues going on there. So you should be good to go. I hope this was of help, and happy racing. Bye-bye.